said that economists have physics envy. So talking on the point of publication, for many years in the physics discipline, publications, although people need to get their nature or their science publication for their record, actually everything is published on a preprint server like arXiv. And in the biological sciences you have bioRxiv. And so these are open access preprint servers which allow anyone to publish and be peer reviewed openly. And this has had a big influence on the way that science is practiced, especially within physics, because no physicist will look at the journal, they'll go to arXiv to view the... And I'm amazed actually that there's no such arXiv preprint server for the economics discipline. So that's something that could actually potentially tackle that form of...
Yeah, it could in principle be tackled, that, sure.
So that's just one point. And another point, which is similarly related to this whole idea of protecting the position, on a discussion, okay, this is not maybe a discussion on economic history, but the economic history thought, to go along these lines with the current power system that we have in place at the moment, and not to mention the influence of the Mont Pelerin Society with Friedrich.
Not to mention what?
The influence of the Mont Pelerin Society. So Hayek and Friedman. And the influence that they have had with the funding and the awards that they do, and which universities and programs that they fund, and the political power that they wield and have done. I think that is a very important topic for discussion on the current system.
Yeah, I think both of those points are valid. In fact, we dealt with the power issue, I think, in a previous lecture, but it sort of comes into this as well. That is, who funds the research programs, and then you always have to ask where the money at the back of things is, and in the case of the Mont Pelerin Society, which was a sort of it was a think tank set up in the 1940s to counter the Keynesian Revolution, and it obviously got funds from business in order to do that. And another very good example of a think tank which was set up for the same purpose was the Institute of Economic Affairs. And the Institute of Economic Affairs was set up in this country in the 1950s. It was funded by a right-wing businessman who didn't like the way the existing, the Keynesian theory was, he didn't like Keynesian theory. He set it up, and it became very influential. But and so you do, of course, all these things are happening. But what I was trying to explain really was the persistence of certain ways of thinking. Why have there been so few revolutions in economics? Why? Because you read Adam Smith, David Ricardo, these 18th century people, and that's basically, you sort of cut out their prose, reduce it to some equations, particularly Ricardo, and then you just get any modern contemporary textbook. Nothing's changed at all. Nothing. Why that? When the world has changed, was it that these people in the 18th century really did discover a universal truth, an immutable truth about the world, which was so true that there's been no need to modify it since? Is that so? I don't believe that.
I think that rings quite true of the universal applicability or universal validity of the equations, in that economics is trying to be as linear as science and discarding new theory after new theory. But as we spoke the other day about perhaps having a different horse for different course kind of method for which theory fits best with each circumstance, because obviously different societies are different. Maybe the fact that it's dominated today by whoever is in control of the current paradigm, or perhaps maybe more Western views, are able to impose their economic theory on the rest. So, for example, for Friedrich List, that would have been England on Germany with a free market. Maybe that's the issue. So it would be finding a happy medium between just completely changing economics, like for different circumstances on a case-by-case basis, and having one that just a best system fits all, which doesn't actually fit all.
Well, you see, you're right. I mean, take free trade. I mean, that's a good example because it's something one is taught quite early on in a course. I think especially, as soon as you do international trade, you get into free trade arguments, theory of comparative advantage, and so on. And that's presented as true. I mean, it's just true. You can prove it. You can prove it arithmetically, yes? America was protectionist in the 19th century, so it had tariffs on foreign imports. From 1945 onwards to about 1980, 1990, America was one of the leaders of free trade and sort of, organized and originated a lot of these tariff reduction conferences that took place in the post-war period. In the last 10 or 15 years, it's become protectionist again. Now, if free trade is always best, and you can prove it's best, how come policy wobbles between free trade and protection?
I wonder if, to some extent, it's a collective action problem where it might always be rational if you know that the other country is pursuing free trade to also pursue free trade. But if you're not sure whether they're going to pursue free trade, or if you know that they're not pursuing it, if they're pursuing a protectionist policy, then perhaps pursuing a free trade position on your own is no longer the rational thing to do.
Well, that may be so, but and that's certainly, I think, been the American view over time. They've always preferred reciprocal treaties. But the English didn't take that view in the 19th century. Following Ricardo, they were unilateral free traders. They didn't impose any conditions. When the Corn Laws were repealed in 1846, that was the end of protection in England, basically. And they did it. They didn't say to others, we'll only do it if you repeal your Corn Laws. They just did it. And the argument is you benefit from even unilateral free trade, even if other countries remain protectionist. You still benefit. And again, you can within limits, and you can prove this arithmetically. But in fact, most countries have taken your view. We'll put on tariffs unless you reduce yours. And if you're prepared to reduce yours, then we'll think about reducing ours. And that is Trump's view.
I think to take a slightly different tack, one thing that has occurred to me is that economics is one of the few disciplines that I'm aware of where you have people actively trying to create what it's studying. And I think this is a really big issue with a lot of the economics that is housed within governments in the form of central banking and the way that they try to manipulate economies while they're also trying to understand and describe them and come up with reasons for why they're behaving that they are. And then also I think that another relationship that is important in understanding perhaps why more paradigm shifts haven't occurred is the close relationship between economics and governance and politics, even though it's no longer necessarily something that's openly acknowledged. And I think correspondingly, if you take a look at politics over the same period that you take a look at the official history of economics, you'll see that there really hasn't been that much in the way of massive shifts in the way governance and politics operates. And I mean, you could say the 1930s and 1940s were possibly the closest to a true shift that we really saw, and that was when you saw the Keynesian Revolution that really posed one of the strongest recent challenges to the current paradigm.
They're both very, very good points. I think the idea that economics is trying to create what it claims to be describing is very, very true, because the objects of study in the natural sciences don't respond to the study that's being done of them, the interventions, but they do in real life. And so you have this curious problem in economics between description and prescription, or between scientific and normative, and you always feel when you're seeing an economic model, are they trying to get you to behave like the model says? Or are you actually behaving like the model says, and that's why they're doing the model that way? And there you always feel that they're trying to get you to behave in a slightly more efficient way. If you set up this kind of thing, they're saying, well, then things will be better. So there's always a prescriptive element. And it shouldn't be ever ignored that economics comes out of theology. And therefore, there's always an element of the preacher in economics. They want to make the world a better place. And they want to make the world a better place, not just by setting up a more efficient type of organization, but by making human beings different, making human beings more efficient. So they really realized that the world could be a better place and weren't subject to such delusions. So that is a very important motive, and economists would often deny that. They're pure scientists, all we're doing is analyzing things, but I think that's oversimplified. And secondly, on your point about politics and economics going hand in hand, it must be so. It must be true. And the Keynesian Revolution is only possible because you have a certain kind of political event, or a set of political events. But the set of political events in the 1930s were themselves responses to a set of catastrophic economic events. But the set of catastrophic economic events were themselves connected to another set of catastrophic political events, like the First World War. So what you had there was the really breakup of the liberal system of the 19th century, both on the political side and on the economic side. And so you had room for something new to creep in and take control of things. And in fact, the Keynesian Revolution was widely accepted by a damaged and frightened ruling class as an antidote to communism.
I was going to quickly, kind of broadly agree with what you were saying. I think because politics is pretty much inherent to economics, you do need to think about interests, and the kind of idea that's, I suppose, is broadly propagated by neoclassical economists that the most recent theory is the best because of kind of linear evolution of economic thought, slowly kind of ironing out the problems and reaching a kind of universally perfect theory. You need to think about the sort of narrative power that kind of gives you.
It's a tapeworm view of economic thought, isn't it?
And I'm reminded of what the Milton Friedman quote, I think it was, that you talked about in a lecture yesterday, where he said, it just so happens that my political principles align with the results of my purely objective analysis of reality. Yeah. Whereas I think, there is kind of a conflict in views of history, whether it's a kind of linear march towards kind of the end of history, the end of economics, or if it is a contingent kind of battleground, and the ideas that become influential are the ones that are best prepared at the time, for example, through the Montpellieran Society.
Yeah.
I just wanted to go back to Ashton's first point, which is about this almost duality of economics trying to create and explain. And I think this is probably a very important question when anyone starts with economics, is trying to figure out this sort of battle here. And it was one of the first ones I had, is what is economics? Is it something that is there to explain a truth, explain how things work, or is it something that we're studying to try and create the best way to create a society of a particular type? And I'm not still sure on the answer, and I'm not sure if those two are actually mutually exclusive or not still, but I think it's something that's very important to discover, because if you take the discovering the truth, then you can take the sort of empirical, scientific aspect to it, because that's what the natural sciences does. It will take the empirical truth, it will falsify, and just whatever's left is the best method, and you can do that. But if you're then trying to create something, then you can't take the natural sciences approach.
You're not trying to get stones to behave differently from what they are, from the behavior you discover. Or, for example, apples. You're not trying to tell them, look, for some reason or other you want to fall to the ground, but actually there's a better way. But in economics, they obviously are trying to do that. They're trying to affect the behavior. They say, look, Adam Smith or someone observes a merchant, observes a market, and that may be natural, and people, and then they think about it, And then they start generalizing. And they say, look, we have this market and it is rather good. Now, if there was a world market, just think how everything would be much better. Because then all the benefits of our little local market in Glasgow would be, generalized all over the world. So let's create this world market. I mean, that's a very noble project, because what it means is that everyone will become as prosperous as the merchants in Scotland were in the 18th century. So they start building these models in which you have a single world market. And then they say, well, in order to do that, we have to persuade these benighted people around the place that, we have to persuade them that trade is good. Trade not just in your local market, but in your national market and then in the world market. It's good. So you gradually create the arguments which generalize the benefit that you've seen very locally and which you've sort of intuited by observing the behavior of a small group of people. And it becomes a grand project. So you get this mindset in which you're always trying to nudge human behavior into directions that are meant to be beneficial. And not to call that prescriptive seems to me just wrong.
And I think in terms of specifically why it's important to study economic history, each economic idea ultimately winds up influencing and changing the conditions of its own era of its genesis, the term I'm looking for, winds up influencing the era of its own genesis. And then from there on, if you look back and you're trying to understand why things occurred that way or why things are the way they are in the present moment, if you don't have that context, you can't recognize the changes and the contributions, then it's really difficult, I think, to truly understand what is at play, what's going on, and what are the forces that are shaping whatever the conditions are that you're looking at. It becomes a cumulative process versus, I think in a lot of the natural sciences, I mean, essentially you're just trying to come up with an understanding of why something the way it is, not necessarily trying to shape or change or influence anything about the way that it is. Yeah. So it's not as important to understand what previous theories were. Yeah. It's more important to understand what the best, most current theory is.
Yeah. No, I do think that's true. I do think that's true, but I do think it's very important that students of economics understand the limits of what they're studying as a way of explaining things.